Welcome everyone to my Introduction to Watercolor class. This is a demonstration of basic watercolor techniques part 1. In this video we're going to be covering just some of the most basic techniques, including flat wash, gradated wash, variegated wash part 1, which is going to be a gradual transition from one color to another, and then another variegated wash in which we're going to merge several different colors that are going to bleed into each other. Here's a look at the materials we're going to be using today, and we'll be using these materials probably for most of the demonstrations, the different lessons in this class. So I've got just a piece of wood here. This is just a chunk of wood that I'm using to prop up my watercolor board. We'll talk about the purpose of that later on in the video. I've got a piece of wood that I'm using for my watercolor board. It's just a thin piece of wood. It's a little over a ½ inch thick, and I'm going to be mounting my watercolor paper to it with tape, and that's to help to keep it from buckling. I've got my paper, which is a cold press 90-pound watercolor paper. It's above a student grade paper, but it's not very expensive. I've got a synthetic round watercolor brush. It's a number 8, and I've got a basic watercolor set, just cakes in a little school set. Again, not very expensive. In fact, all of the materials we're going to be using in these videos, this series of videos, are not very expensive. I've also got a pencil that I'm going to need. I've got a container for my water. I'll need some masking tape. I've got a sponge and paper towel. Alright, so let's get started. Okay, so I'm going to line my paper up on my watercolor board, and I'm going to tape down all of the sides. We're just doing a couple of exercises here. We're not going to pre-stretch it. There's a way to pre-stretch your paper, but we're not going to take the time to do that. Right now I'm just going to tape down all the edges, masking tape or drafting tape, and I'm going to try to put it half on, half off the paper. So it'll adhere to that board. Now I'm going to put a strip of tape horizontally through the center and another piece of tape vertically through the center. What this is going to do is create 4 boxes where I'm going to do my 4 different basic watercolor techniques. Okay, so I've got everything set up here and ready to go. I got my watercolor paints, I got my water, my sponge, my paper towel. The first wash that I'm going to do is called a flat wash. This is just an even area of a single color, and I'm going to show you how to get this as even as possible. The other thing I've done here is I have propped up my watercolor board up at the top so that the water drains down the paper as I'm painting it in. So what I'm going to do here now is mix the paint that I need. I'm going to mix a large puddle of paint. I'm going to use green for this. And I'm going back and forth between dipping my brush into the water, adding some water to the green paint, soaking some of that up on my brush, and then transferring it over to the lid of the set, the watercolor set that I'm using. And I'm using that as a palette. And I just want to keep doing this until I've got a large puddle of paint build up and ready to go. Now the consistency should be liquid. One of the things that you're going to want to do in this lesson and in succeeding or following lessons is have a piece of test paper that you can test your colors out on. It takes a balance between the right amount of water and the right amount of paint that you want. And so put just a little brush stroke of that puddle of paint on there so I can see how dark it's going to be. And then I can adjust it as needed. Just something that I think I covered before, but I'm going to remind you guys of here is you don't want to use watercolors too thick. They should always be a liquid. There shouldn't be a time whenever you're using them the consistency of acrylic paints. So they can get pretty dark, but they should still be some kind of a fluid consistency. All right, so I've got my color ready here. My green color is what I'm going to use first for this flat wash. You always want to make sure that you have enough paint. You don't want to get stuck where you've run out of paint and you don't have enough to finish the area that you're working on. That's whenever you get a lot of watermarks and inconsistencies. And right now in this exercise, what we're going for is as smooth and even a look or a wash as we can get. So I'm going to load up my brush with green, that mixture of green and water, and I'm going to start at the top. And what I'm doing is I'm putting a stroke of paint across the top, a horizontal stroke, dipping my brush back into the paint, and then putting another stroke that touches it, the succeeding stroke, but is just underneath. You can see how it's even darker because it's almost puddled up right across that bottom stroke. And gradually work my way down. Now the reason I want to do this and have my paper tilted so it's all draining down is two reasons. One is to keep the leading edge wet. In other words, that lowest stroke that I put on, the next stroke that I put down, I know it's going into wet paint. Wet into wet paint will keep a smooth wash. So if I were going wet over dry, if that stroke had a chance to dry, then where those two strokes overlap would be a darker area and a watermark. This way it ensures that it's wet into wet paint and I don't have watermarks. The second reason I have it tilted is because the paper buckles. Now if this was sitting flat, it would create these valleys where all of that color would pool and look darker after it dries. This way, with the paper tilted, it's all flowing in one direction. It's flowing down and it's not collecting in those dips or those valleys that are caused from the paper buckling. That way it'll help to make it look even. So I'm finished. That looks pretty even. It's going to look even more even when it dries. Something I'm going to do here though is I'm going to take my brush, clean it out, and I'm just going to touch it onto the sponge to dry it off a little bit, not completely. And then I'm going to use my brush to lift out just a little bit of that dark puddle that's along the bottom of the wash. And then I'm going to allow it to dry. It's probably going to take maybe 15-20 minutes to dry. Okay, while that's drying, we're going to continue with the next wash, which is called a gradated wash. First, though, I need to get my sponge and soak up the rest of the green puddle there, and then get my paper towel and dry it off and soak as much of it up as I can. I'm going to use blue for this next wash, and we're actually going to need 3 different versions of blue. We're going to need a light value blue, middle value blue, and a dark value blue. And this is all going to depend upon the amount of pigment versus water. So I'm going to start with a puddle in the center that's just going to be straight blue. Then to the left, I'm going to add more water to the blue to try to make a lighter value of blue. And then to the right of that, I'm going to mix a darker value. This is going to have less water and more pigment in the mixture. Again, I'm going to make sure that I have enough. I want these 3 puddles to be fairly big. And I'm also going to test these colors out first to make sure that I have the right values. And you can really use any paper for your test paper. It can be watercolor paper. Now I'm going to start with the lightest value, which has more water in the mixture. Dip it in there and then put a stroke across the top. And I'll do that for maybe 2 strokes. Now I'm going to get a little bit of the second mixture and mix it with that top mixture just to make it a little bit darker and work my way down. Now I switch it completely over to that middle value, and then gradually I'm adding a little bit of the darkest value into that middle tone. And finally I'm just going to use the darkest value across the bottom to finish it off. And it's not perfect, but you can see that I got a gradual transition from light to dark. And that'll look a little bit more even as it dries. This technique, the gradated wash, could be used for something like a surface of water, like a lake, or it could be used for a sky as it goes darker to lighter at the horizon. So there's a lot of different uses for this technique. Now I'll clean off the tray using my sponge. Then I'm going to clean the rest of it off using a paper towel. Now I'm going to move on to the variegated wash. And with this first variegated wash, I'm going to do a nice even transition between two colors. For this one, I'm going to use a warm and a cool color. I'm going to go from orange to violet. And when I begin, I'm going to start with orange because it's my lightest value color. Just something I tend to do is I tend to mix the warm color first because they tend to be a weaker pigment. If I start with the cool or darker color first, a lot of times if there's any residue of it left over in my brush, it'll really change the color of the warm color and make it more dull. So that's why I'm starting with orange. So I'm going to make sure that I have a nice big puddle of orange to begin with. For the middle color, I'm going to mix orange and violet together. I'll start by adding some orange here. Now I'm going to begin adding the violet. Again, I want to make sure I have a big enough puddle, and I want to make sure that it's a liquid. It should be a liquid consistency, not too thick. And then I clean my brush off, and now I'm just going to mix a puddle of violet. Again, I have my paper tilted. I'm going to test these colors out. So I got my orange. I've got my middle color, which is a mixture of orange and violet in sort of a muted tone. And then I've got my pure violet. Now I'm going to start with the orange at the top. Again, for the same reason. I want my orange to be vibrant. If I started with violet at the top, there would be a tendency for that violet to flow down into the orange and make it more muted. This way I ensure that my lightest color, orange, stays very, very vibrant. And I do 1 or 2 strokes of pure orange. Now I'm going to gradually start mixing in a little bit of that middle color into the orange. I'll add a bit more of that middle color in with the orange. And now I switch completely over to that middle color, that muted tone, which is a mixture of orange and violet. I do a few strokes of that. And then gradually mix violet into that middle color. And then I'm going to end with just pure violet. And you can see that looks pretty even right now, a nice transition from orange to violet. So I'm going to let that dry, and it should even out even more. Now it's time to clean off the tray using the sponge and a paper towel. Now I'm going to do the last demonstration for this video, which is variegated wash part 2. This is going to be a more random mixture or blending of different colors. And we'll be using this sort of variegated wash quite a bit as we move through these different video demonstrations. For this wash, I'm going to use the 3 primary colors, yellow, red, and blue. I'm going to make sure that I have a nice size puddle of each color, starting with the yellow, the red, and the blue. For this final wash, I'm going to remove that piece of wood that I have tilting up my watercolor board and paper. And I want to paint this on a flat surface. And I'm just going to start dabbing in and painting in various sections of yellow. I'll start with it first. It can be pretty random. Then I'll just start dabbing in some of the red. And I want to touch those areas of yellow with the red and do this pretty quickly while everything is still wet so that these colors bleed together. And I'm going to leave just a little bit of white space now for my blue and fill in the rest of those areas with blue. and randomly dab some areas and some strokes of blue in other places, just so these colors bleed together randomly. It almost looks, I don't know, a bit like a tie-dye effect. We're going to see how this can be applied for a lot of different things in watercolor paintings, for skies, water, just to give you some color quality, some varying color. Okay, so there are my 4 basic watercolor techniques that I've demonstrated in this video. That last one I gave about 15-20 minutes for it to dry. I want to make sure that it's completely dry. And what I mean by that is you should be able to touch the paper with the back of your hand and it doesn't even feel cold. For the center areas, that vertical and horizontal piece of tape across the center, it might rip a little bit. That's always a possibility. What I'm going to do is peel it very low toward the paper. That'll help to keep it from ripping. And I want to go very slowly too. Now for the edges, what I want to do is almost peel it away at a 90-degree angle away from my painting. That way, if it would happen to rip, it's not going to tear into the painting itself. It'll only tear off of the border, so you really won't even notice it. It'll just look white. And I think those turned out pretty good. Now what I'm going to do is label each one. I'm just going to take a pencil and write the name of the wash underneath each section. First, we have our flat wash. This is just one solid area of a color. Next, we have a gradated wash, which is a gradual transition from light to dark of a single color. Third, we have our first variegated wash. In this case, it was going from orange to violet, an even transition. And then last, we have our second variegated wash, which is a more random pattern of colors bleeding into each other to create sort of an atmospheric effect. So we will be using each of these different washes in one form or another throughout the different lessons that we do in this class. I hope you enjoyed this demonstration, and I hope to see you for the next one. Thank you. Have a great day.